When even routine school conversations are emotionally charged, how can principals and teachers even have conversations with parents in this polarized world? Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your hosts, along with Shelley Steele. We're retired educators who worked in adjacent school districts in Ontario, and now we're retired, and we are both leads in restorative practices. Our returning guests this episode are Dr. Emily Jenkins, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair, University of British Columbia, Scientific Director of Wellstream and Bienamont, the Canadian Centre for Innovation in Child and Youth Mental Health and Substance Use in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Dr. Ngieng, Deputy Superintendent of Abbey Schools in Abbotsford, British Columbia. We talk about the importance of shifting away from deficit thinking toward recognizing student and family and community strengths as the foundation for productive conversations and shared problem solving.
Hi, I'm Paula, an AI voice. This episode is brought to you by the word polarization, which is driven more by identity threat than by disagreement. In schools, polarization rarely forms because people disagree on ideas. It forms because people feel their identity, values, or professional integrity are under threat. Teachers may hear feedback as, "I'm not a good teacher." Parents may hear school decisions as, "You don't respect my family." Administrators may experience resistance as, "You don't understand our reality." Once identity is activated, the brain shifts from problem solving to self-protection, making collaboration neurologically harder, even among well-intentioned educators.
Our website, www.restorative.ca, is for principals and teachers who navigate difficult conversations with parents, who want to make things right, and who want to make it all about student learning. If you're new to your role in the last 3 or 4 years, email me, stan@restorative.ca. Shelley's away this episode, so let's join the conversation with your host, me, Stan. When you have situations where you have to have difficult conversations with parents or with other adults, how does the context that we find ourselves in, like the world today, how does that impact the way we go about having these conversations? Just a small question I thought I'd throw in there. What do you think?
An easy softball one.
Hey, yeah, we got 40 minutes to solve this one right here. Go.
What do you think, Emily?
It's a big question. And I feel like the context, the world we're living in right now, is one where it can often feel quite divisive, where we can often find ourselves in conversations where people have different perspectives on an issue. And when we're talking about kids, I think often in schools, we share a common goal that we're wanting to help a child to have a good experience, a good opportunity to succeed in school and that kind of thing, and in their family be supported. And yet there's different ways and different ideas about how we get to that place. And I think that can create some conflict, which makes those difficult conversations even more difficult at times. I think that recognizing that often we have that shared goal in mind, even if we're coming from it from different angles or different perspectives or lived experiences, that ultimately, where can we connect on those shared interests around the child? And I think one of the ways that can be really nice is to take a strengths-based perspective there. And when we're having these challenging conversations, to start from a place where we're acknowledging the strengths of the child, the strengths of the family, the strengths of the school community that is supporting that child, and kind of take it from there as a starting place. And I think that can just help to make for a conversation that is more productive.
I think two things that you mentioned that I really appreciate. One is the shared interest, what's best for the student. And the second, starting with strengths of the student. So there are other things we have to talk about. Let's start with that. Nathan, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we live in times where polarization just seems to be the norm. And so the ability to have a conversation about difference is really hard to have in the context that we live in today. One of the pieces that I remind myself of when we enter into these tough conversations is the ability to listen, to try and understand, versus listening to stated position. Subtle yet important, because I think lots gets lost in the interaction when I'm trying to prove my point. So the polarization results in my just trying to tell you why you're wrong versus my trying to understand what your experience has been and where you're coming from and how does that connect or not connect with mine to understand. And I think that's lacking because of the current context we're in. Many conversations with our leaders. I had a bit of a conversation with our senior team here at the beginning of the week around our positionality as leaders and the kinds of things that we're hoping for in the system. And to your point around, and it is interesting, the gifts that every child brings, which is deeply embedded in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, right? That was the center of our Indigenous ways of being that got lost in colonization and this idea of deficit thinking, right? And it's broken, let's fix it. And the conversations that come with kids around, we've talked about the challenge in our system being medicalized to a point of putting a label and trying to fix versus understanding what an individual child or young person brings to the table as a gift, right? And because those are the kinds of conversations we want. We think about ourselves. And again, it's that perspective taking about where we thrive. You thrive when you're supported and have a sense of agency around what our strengths, right? And we all have things that we work on, right? Everyone is built that way. And so I think it's trying to shift the conversations in a manner that allow for us to talk about difference, to talk about strengths, and to share a space where we're trying to understand versus proving that someone is wrong.
It's interesting you mentioned that because we just recently did a series of workshops with some schools in northwestern Ontario, and the theme was listen to understand, not to respond, which is exactly what you're saying. I want to just understand what it is that you're saying. Now, I want to take this to a more specific topic, which is substance abuse education, something that is near and dear to both of your hearts through work that you've done together. How can we help educators to have difficult conversations in a polarized environment about an important topic like substance abuse?
Yes, very near and dear to both of us in some of the work that we're leading, in particular, the development of a pan-Canadian standard to support educators and how they go about doing this work that they do day in, day out to provide education and respond to substance use in schools. And one of the things that I think has really come forward in this shared work with education professionals, health professionals, and youth from across the country is that schools are already doing a lot of this in their everyday practices and often aren't necessarily recognizing that as an approach to substance use prevention. And so when you say, like, what would you recommend in terms of having this difficult conversation? In a way, I don't actually think it's always a difficult conversation. It's around creating connections with students so that they know you and trust you, and that there's a relationship there for when these types of issues start to come up, which is often a normal part of development through childhood and adolescence. And our standard addresses kindergarten through grade 12. That's a large developmental period. And so we've broken it down so that we've got the early childhood, the early and middle adolescence, and the later adolescence phases, recognizing that there may be different approaches during those stages. But a lot of what we recommend is that there's these opportunities to help students to navigate decision making, to build resilience. So it's about encountering challenges in life in a way that they feel equipped to deal with the results of those challenges and can address them head on and have that kind of perseverance to get through. And then they've got these people in their lives, these adults that are surrounding them day in and day out through schools where they feel that they trust them and that those people care about them. And that goes a long way. And so that's my initial response. And we can get more specific about substance use conversations.
It's an interesting piece. And if you talk to educators in the classroom, you say, what's your approach to substance use prevention and intervention? You'll likely get a lot of discomfort about what they should be doing. And I think to Emily's point, that many of our educators are already doing the things that we would point to as preventative measures, because it isn't talking about substances and the negative impact. When you begin to, and I remember an opportunity I had with one of our local substance use agencies that partnered with us around prevention intervention a number of years ago, to hear the stories of those impacted, right? And it comes out of pain, whether it's physical or mental. And some of the recent research, Emily pointed to the caring adult. And I can connect to situations. I'm an elementary trained educator. And while I wouldn't speak to this particular program or things I would do talking about substances, the impact of the use of those substances, I could certainly talk about the environment in which we create in terms of connection and belonging. And if, what stuck with me in that conversation I had with one of our providers was this idea of pain and maladaptive strategies to cope with pain. And if we look at what are some things we can do in our environment. So if I think about myself, right, if I'm feeling down or if I'm feeling disconnected, it's the environment and what helps me. We can talk about things like 2 or more caring adults. Did I have people that I could go to? What was my peer group? What was my opportunity to participate here in our school district? An emphasis on extracurricular, right? With this idea of getting people involved in things that can create community for them, right? Those are all things that help create a system or an environment that will perhaps allow an individual to choose some more, I'll say, healthier alternatives to addressing some of the pain that they're feeling when it comes to perhaps getting involved with substances. And I think at a universal level, and some of the things that we've been in discussion around with Emily's group and the work that's happening with Wellstream, that's a key piece, right? The environment and the adults and the opportunities, and with an understanding about substance use prevention intervention isn't necessarily just talking about substances and their impact, right? It's understanding the individual and how they're being impacted in their environment.
I really like that substance use as a maladaptive response to pain. And then what that raises for me is like nobody really likes to experience pain and nobody really likes to have a painful conversation. So my tendency as an adult in a school with another adult or with a parent is to avoid that conversation. So if I can avoid pain, I'll do that. I don't think that's realistic in life, candidly. Pain is part of life, and how we respond to it is really important. But what can we suggest for the adults who are really, you talked about it, Nathan, the teachers are really uncomfortable about having this conversation, and maybe the principal is uncomfortable having that conversation with a parent. How can we encourage them and help them with that?
You have to be open, and you just have to, as a school principal, one of the ways I did that is I knew every kid's name, right? And the little impact to open the door to a further conversation is if a young person knows that you care about them. And we've heard that time and time again with some of the student voice work that we've done, that if a student or a young person knows that you care about them, they're more likely to open up, right, and share. And we can see that in some of the surveys that have been done, right, for kids across time. And the reluctance to connect or create those connections can sometimes result in a young person turning to something that perhaps we wouldn't want them to, just at a very basic level. And so I think for an educator, it's as you're making your way through the day, as you're designing lessons or activities, that connection piece with kids, right? We've learned a lot about the intersectionality of identities as well, right? And the importance of acceptance and being validated for who you are. And we can play that out in a number of different places. And again, talking about polarization, where we see some of the things that young people are grappling with as what they look at in the media, on their phones, the kinds of conversations they're involved with. We can create opportunities for young people to connect with adults and peers where they can feel safe and connected. That goes a long way. And for the adults to know that it's just as simple as demonstrating a level of care. You don't have to have knowledge on a particular thing for you don't have to go above and beyond, but it might just simply by knowing the student's name and asking how their morning went. that might be the thing that opens the door.
I think as I'm listening to this, I am reflecting on this universal level of principle that we're talking about here. Every student deserves an opportunity to go to a school where they feel safe and valued and connected, and where they have people who care about them and who can see the strengths that they bring, despite some of the other experiences that they might go through or the challenging behaviors that might happen, that still there's somebody championing them and that can see through that aspect of their communication to what they bring in their heart as a strength. And I think that's really important. And then as we move along maybe the spectrum of substance use and we start to be thinking about kids who are either more at risk due to broader conditions that they're living in, whether it be other behavioral challenges that they have, those kinds of things, then we want to be thinking more of what we would consider a tier 2 or tier 3 type of intervention. And so in the standard that we're working to develop, we also lay out that there's these tier 1 universal types of intervention that are largely focused on relationship and connection and social emotional principles and regulation and all of those good things. And then when we've got smaller groups of students where there might be more concentrated risk, or where we have students who we know are using substances, that there might be other approaches that we start to bring into play there. And that's where you move from a reliance on the teachers and the principals and the support staff that are in schools to thinking about some of the folks who have specialized expertise in that area or that have built connections. And this is a big part of what we're advocating for, is those connections between school and community-based resources or health services that are better equipped to deal with some of that specialized type of situation. In a school situation, though, one of the things that Nathan brought up that I think is really important around that connection piece is having a really genuine type of relationship and creating opportunities for open conversation and dialogue about this issue. And we've talked about how it can be something that is quite uncomfortable for people to talk about. And we found that in our research over a decade ago, when we were hearing from educators that this was just before cannabis was legalized here in Canada. And we were hearing from educators that lots of kids are smoking pot, lots of adults in their lives, maybe some of the educators themselves use it. And so it created this kind of gray area where people felt almost immobilized around how do we talk about an issue where it's widespread and yet there's a current kind of legal status that makes certain risks in that context as well. But what we really were hearing from youth at the time is that they so did not connect with the messages of just say no and an abstinence only approach. And they could see right through it when people were telling them, these risks are bigger than what they were experiencing for themselves when they would try smoking a joint, let's say. And so what we've really been advocating for and trying to create opportunities to support educators in are having those open conversations that are inclusive spaces for youth who are abstinent or haven't started to explore substances, right through to those who might qualify for meeting a substance use disorder type of diagnosis, that they have a space to express their experiences in a safe way as well, and where people will hear them and support them and help them manage navigating decision making in that area. But I think that was one of the key things, was really to create that open dialogue that didn't just shut out an opportunity to talk about the realities of growing up today.
Listening to understand, not to respond, is so important. It comes up again and again. Conversations in school that build community move beyond defending positions toward understanding lived experience and perspective and emotional context. And as you just heard in this conversation, reframing substance use prevention away from the fear-based messaging towards building connection, belonging, resilience, and tiered supports. So what resonated with you and what challenges do you face? Take a couple minutes to fill in the feedback form in the podcast description. Having conversations and making connections is part of what educators do day to day, and it's so important for students, particularly when talking about substance use. So if you've got questions, email me, stan@restorative.ca, so we can have a conversation about some of the how-tos of making connections as a part of what you do as a school leader.